I'm Dave Greenwood, and this is Overcoming Distractions. If you are an adult with ADHD, a busy professional, an entrepreneur, a high achiever, or just need some strategies to navigate your adult ADHD, you're in the right place. Who am I? I'm an entrepreneur with ADHD and the author of 2 books, Overcoming Distractions and Overcoming Burnout. I coach and mentor people just like you, and together we navigate the ups and downs of adult ADHD. From getting out of our own way to helping people just like you thrive in the workplace. That's what I do. Want more info on working with me? Hit overcomingdistractions.com. Ready? Let's get to today's podcast. All right, gang, we are back, and I want to thank you once again for hitting that download button. And we're going to talk about something that I really think a lot of us need a little bit of, as they say, 101, getting right back to the basics, and it's about kindness. One thing I know to be true after working with a lot of people one-on-one, whether it's adult ADHD, people going through burnout, maybe it's both, is that we need to be more kind to ourselves. We beat ourselves up for a bunch of things happening in our lives, and I just don't think it needs to be this way. We ask ourselves all kinds of questions. Why am I like this? Why can't I do X, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera? And I know this resonates with a lot of you. So we're talking about implementing some kindness to ourselves today. And today I have the author of The Kindness Cure, Dr. Tara Cousineau. Did I pronounce your name right?
Yeah, close enough. Tara Cousineau.
Is it Cousineau? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you asked me in the beginning, do I edit? So maybe I'll edit that. So, but I'm not going to beat myself up. It's Tara Cousineau, PhD, author of The Kindness Cure, a meditation teacher, and you also talk about being a perfectionism coach, right?
Yes. Yeah. My newer book is actually on called The Perfectionist Dilemma, and it's on self-compassion. So it is about kindness, turning that towards yourself.
Oh, and so we're recording this at the end of April 2024. Is that book out yet, or are you still working on it?
That's not going to be out until January.
Okay. So
yeah.
So everybody,
I'll let you know. I'll come back and visit.
Yeah, because you definitely have to come back, because that is a massive topic here when it comes to professional busy adults with ADHD. So can you tell us a little bit more about your work? I know I had you on a few years ago. We met at an event, but can you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing for about over 20 years. I'll leave it at that. So I, in the area that I live in, the majority of my clients are high achievers, and they struggle with trying to manage their lives. So totally aligned with what you talk about, David, in terms of, burnout. And I mean, plenty of people with attention regulation issues, whether they're diagnosed with ADHD or not, a lot of our attention gets hijacked and conditioned in certain ways growing up. So attention is actually something that I pay a lot of attention to, actually, because it's guiding people to learn how to be more attentive and intentional about how they live their lives. So I have a part-time private practice, and I work part-time at Harvard University's Counseling and Mental Health Service. So I see people between the ages of 18 and 40, essentially, who are trying to do good things in the world and might struggle with achievement-oriented goals, imposterism, perfectionism, trying to fit in a sea of excellence, and they don't know where to fit in. So it just comes out one way or another, whether it's in the community or on a university setting. People are just trying to figure out who they are, how they fit in, and how to make a difference in the world. And so hopefully I'm one of their guides along the way.
Yeah. No, you just checked a bunch of boxes that come up regularly here. So so let's dig in, because I know, like I said, when I work with people, a lot of people are just kind of they're tough on themselves. And again, I've used the scenario a million times about the bad report cards and all the stuff. And I'm a 60s kid, so if you grew up in my era, you know exactly what I'm talking about because we were the misunderstood, so to speak. So,
Yeah.
but can we just back up to why you wrote The Kindness Cure? What was that moment where you said this book really needs to get out?
Yeah, it's interesting. At the time, and I'm going to guess that this is now going back a little ways, and I had my kids were teenagers, daughters in high school. There was a pretty contentious presidential election happening at the time, and there was just a lot of hate discourse that seemed to be, to me, from my perspective, amplified in so many different ways, whether that was social media, the news, or just what was happening in the world. And but it was a really personal event that instigated the book. And it was my daughter was a senior in high school. It was the first night before senior year started, and all the kids hang out in the woods like they do in almost every community. You know, it's the docks, it's the woods, it's forever.
Yeah, right.
And and they were celebrating being seniors, and she was sort of leaving that area, and she was physically attacked by another girl. Like literally, just a girl jumped out and and I was like, what is going on? And she didn't tell me for 24 hours, because
Mhm.
she knew that I would be mad that she was in the woods in their first place.
Right.
So I have actually a message to parents like, never tell your kids not to do anything because they'll think that if they do it, they can't tell you about it. Um, but that really kind of rattled me. It was someone who had, slept over our house growing up, watching Harry Potter films. Like, what was going on? What's going on with kids that this is how they're trying to solve their problems? But it was so much in the news anyway. And then there was these sort of zero hate policies happening. It was just crazy, but I feel like we're exactly at that place right now. So I could write this book all over again, and the only thing that would change about it is what's happening in our culture now. Like I would just be updating the cultural pressures,
Right.
actually.
Yeah.
And so I had a question. So, I was, part-time researcher at the time, and I just was like, what happened to kindness? Like that literally was my question. Like, what happened to kindness in our public discourse? Because it seemed to be completely absent. And not that people weren't trying, but it just seemed to be, absent. And there were all the school shootings, all sorts of things that seemed to be just regular, and they are regular now, and people have sort of numbed themselves out to a lot of these things. So I started digging into the research, like really, like how does kindness manifest in our human body, in our human condition? Is there anything out there that's interesting to know about kindness? And so that's when I started digging in the weeds, and it got it pretty interesting in terms of how empathy manifests in the brain. Uh, Um, what stops, like what sort of reduces those neural networks from working.
Yeah.
And so that's when I just got really intrigued, and I thought, like you like to do the 101. I was like, well, what are the basics here? And so I just wrote a book about the basics, and a lot of it actually has to do with setting the groundwork within yourself first, right? We
Yeah.
can't expect culture to change, but we can control how we live our lives.
No, no, and I think that's a perfect segue to my next question. What is like if there was like one or two overall lessons that um uh, you know those of
Yeah,
us
I
with
think,
ADHD like to get the answer first before we get into this. So
yeah,
I want to give
well,
people like a value bomb here. So what is like the
yeah.
one or two lessons that you really want people to walk away when they read this book?
Well, one, we're all born with the capacity to be compassionate. It's part of our neural network. And
Yeah.
but we have to exercise it. And we need to exercise it in a regular way so that we can really hone those sort of the neural tracks, if you will, in the brain. And empathy can be sort of short-circuited, if you will. Like we can actually, through stress, through trauma, through a lot of challenges in life, we can actually sort of depress those neural networks and then don't have access to the prefrontal cortex, which I'm sure that you talk about a lot, like our executive functions, right?
Oh
When we're
yeah.
stressed, we can't actually access our executive functions. And so compassion is actually, it requires executive function elements. We have to be
Yeah.
able to pause. We have to be able to kind of step back. We have to be able to kind of take an outsider perspective on things. We need the space to problem solve. And so So I think just really seeing that the compassion networks, there's like a bridge, in terms of sort of what happens in the brain. And then when we start to exercise compassion, self-compassion, compassion for others, we actually strengthen those neural networks and the gray matter in our brain starts to thicken. Like there
Yeah.
are actual tangible things that happen in our physiology when we start practicing kindness for ourselves and others. And so we have to prune that. We have to tend to it, just like we would a garden, for example. And when we don't, because we get over busy, we get addicted to busyness, we're into productivity, we're into achievements, and actually we start to really dampen down our natural capacities to be kind to others and ourselves. So I
You
think that
brought
was
up,
one thing.
yeah, that's interesting because every time I've noticed when we talk about executive functions on here, it's like double the download numbers because it's because it's just something that I think people are craving a lot more knowledge and understanding about because it is complicated. There are many executive functions. I mean, the simplest is, working memory, walking into a room and forgetting why you were there. But it's this is a lot more
Yeah.
complicated than that. But you're telling me that some of your research has indicated that the kindness and self-compassion and what have you has a direct effect on our executive functions, correct?
Well, I think it's a cycle, right? It's a self-reinforcing kind of process. So when I see a lot of people who think they have ADHD or are diagnosed with ADHD, obviously in a university setting, and the way that I try to see it, and I'm not necessarily an ADHD expert at all, actually. I wouldn't even consider myself a neuropsychologist, but really what we're talking about is our capacity to regulate attention, just like our capacity to regulate emotions. And when we are hijacked by the world, it's very difficult to regulate those basic functions. Stress really gets in the way. And so my approach typically, and also with kindness, is that we first have to actually really attend to our nervous systems
Yeah.
in a very intentional way on a daily basis. Like, whatever the skills are, and there's thousands of them out there, and you pick the ones that you feel are good for you, but that we really actually first have to keep our nervous systems regulated. And then everything else just gets so much easier and fluent, if you will. So, so we need to I just say self-regulation, and it affects lots of capacities, and it's not like a direct correlation. It's all intertwined. It's more like the brain body is like a simulator, right? And
Yeah.
so things are just going to kind of shift no matter what you do, one way or another, because our body is very responsive and our brain is also predictive, and so we can actually mess around, if you will, kind of hack our brain by changing our predictions, like not doing the same thing over and over again, by doing different kinds of behaviors, we start interrupting the prediction in our cycles and we can create new habits. And so it's really a lot about self-regulation, I think.
Uh, as I dug more into burnout, because this is something that I
Mm-hmm.
personally experienced, and that's why I wrote the second book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was, I interviewed a bunch of people that went through some really severe experiences with burnout, but I was amazed at the obviously the mental uh, uh, symptoms such as exhaustion and, as you say, the reduced executive functions, but the physical symptoms as well that stress uh, took on the body.
Yes.
And I'm sure you're aware of the book, but the body keeps the score, and I can't remember the author's name. I can't
Oh
pronounce
yeah,
this.
Bessel van der Kolk. Yeah,
It
yeah, yeah,
exactly it was just.
yeah.
It's a hard read, but there's one there's a it's a book that is so aptly titled.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Mm-hmm.
the body is keeping the score on this, and I can imagine years of not being kind to yourself and not being self-compassionate can maybe take a similar toll as you mentioned, or in terms of
Absolutely. I mean, burnout is a tricky one because oftentimes there's just a really terrible, job person match. Like I think that we really have to kind of understand our what our bodies need for quality of life, and then try to find, the kind of work or career that we want to do. So a lot of people end up in the wrong job matches, and they think there's something wrong with them when in fact they're in the wrong environment for their physiology. And so I work with a lot of people with burnout, and sometimes the hardest thing is to actually change jobs because they feel like a failure, when in fact it's like, no, you will thrive when you find yourself in a different environment.
Yeah.
But with burnout, or, sort of our addictions to productivity, it really does interfere, because what is stress? It is an increase in cortisol in the body. Cortisol is a sugar, and we need that for energy. And when we are overusing that, that will cause inflammation, and inflammation then will cause a whole lot of things: migraines, headaches, IBS, tons of digestive issues, poor sleep, insomnia, you name it, people will have it. And that's when they actually show up in therapy, is actually when their body has shut down,
Yeah.
and they don't even see the connection with the stress
No,
and
and
the
it's
mental.
even everybody I've worked with it was pretty much too late. I mean, too late, not in the sense, but that should have been addressed a long time ago, you know.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that I've been, quite frankly, railing on lately on social media is, not just the workplace, but um, caregivers, where
Mhm.
they're going through a
Mhm.
tremendous amount of stress. And it's almost, some people are trapped. But recently, and again, we're recording this in April 2024, but um, CBS started doing a series on caregiving, about the cost of caregiving,
Yeah.
and that was one of them, is the stress and all the even people beating themselves up because they're in that kind of situation, you know?
It's very, very difficult. We've personally, my husband and I have gone through it already with both his parents who've passed now. But it is really difficult. And going back to the compassion piece, is that when we are overstressed and overloaded with responsibilities and tasks that we have to pay attention to, we can really kind of deactivate those compassion networks,
Yeah,
where we get snippy, frustrated, angry. And it's understandable, because we haven't actually given our brain and body the rest that it needs. So caregivers, people who, just at the average person these days, they're not giving their body and their nervous system enough rest. And so part of, in the book, The Kindness Cure, there are a number of chapters of real, it's much easier actually to be kinder to other people, because it's socially, you know, supported, and we have the tendency, the golden rule still lives, believe it or not, even though sometimes we don't, but it's much easier to lend a helping hand to somebody else than it is to ourselves.
yeah,
And so what I'm trying to do a lot of times in my work is to actually reverse that, is that you actually have to take care of yourself before you are even able to take care of somebody else. And so how do we do that? And like you said, a lot of people have conditioning or shame experiences about who they are, and their abilities. And so we have to address the inner critical voices that arise over a lifetime. And there are a number of different approaches around that, but one of the simplest ways is to imagine somebody that you love is going through the stress that you are experiencing, you know, dealing with, having to take care of a family member or having a high stress job. What would you say to that person? How would you help that person?
yeah,
And then say that to yourself. And that's where people get really stumped, because it sounds like, in theory, really simple. Because if you're going to hug a friend or say, hey, man, it's going to be okay. You're a good human. You're doing good work. Take a breath, take a rest. You deserve it. For people to actually say that to themselves is very, very difficult.
yeah,
So it takes practice, because it's like literally learning a new language.
yeah, yeah. No, I can see that, and there's a lot of, and I do see this in the adult ADHD world, where people do put on a good game face,
Mhm.
in public
Yes.
settings or in work or what have you, um, but they kind of get behind that closed door, um, and it's a different ball game. I know a lot of people that that work with me. And I like to say I work on the mechanics of ADHD. I'm not a therapist or anything. I mean, we try and kind of figure out how to manage workload and time and all that stuff. But a lot of times people, we get on a session and they just want to talk because nobody else, they don't have anybody else to talk to, not even a spouse. Some people that, as I say, some people don't get us, when it comes to the ADHD brain. And a lot of times and again, I tell people flat out, look, I'm not a therapist. Okay. But if you want to talk to somebody who's, been there, that's great. But I mean, and I can kind of see that where there's nobody around them that they can talk to about these things because nobody totally understands the brain,
Right. Which
Yeah.
actually comes to my second point about the book. You said, what are some of the things that, were interesting to me when I was writing it. And the second piece, so the first piece is the internal piece, is that we actually can sort of shape our brains and our nervous systems when we start to actually take care of them in a very important, significant way. And that takes a lot of daily practice. Then there's the research that comes from Fowler and Christakis about the 3 degrees of influence rule. And that's basically that anything that you sort of inject into your social network, online, offline, whatever, whoever you're connected to, is going to have an influence 3 degrees out. So if you're going to inject something negative, guess what is going to amplify that,
Yeah.
right? If you're going to inject something positive, what's going to amplify that? And so I really love this idea of the 3 degrees of influence concept because they can map it out now. They can map it out on research. They've shown it with heart disease, weight, a lot of health factors, but there are social factors too. And so this is where I think some of the work, it's very easy to inject negativity and have that spread rapid fire. With kindness, it actually takes more consistent effort because our attention networks will focus on the negative. It will prioritize the negative over the positive. And so we have to really have allies around us to get that 3 degrees of influence rule working. So like when you're doing your podcast or you're talking to people who are suffering in the same way and finding support from one another, that is so key because it's going to amplify the feeling of belonging, feeling understood, hopefully some stress release, some good, oxytocin being released and some good bonding, So I think that there's the work that we can do internally in our lives, by finding rest, meditation, those sorts of things. And then there's the piece about connecting to other people. And when we connect to other people in positive, healing, helpful ways, that spreads too. And I think that the tricky thing with our brains, which none of us can help, is that the brain will prioritize fear every time. We are just
Yeah.
wired that way. And so when we can minimize that, and redirect our attention, we have to actually, I call it joyful effort, like put in the joyful effort. What is something that you can do for yourself and somebody else every day? Like it becomes a practice. So I'm going to, I'll throw my husband under the bus here, but he's a very, very funny guy. And, but he has had this practice for years, is that he tries to make one person laugh every day.
Yeah.
Whether it's the gas station guy or going to the Dunkin' Donuts, he's always joking with people, and of course that makes him feel better about himself. But he gets a couple of people laughing, and that's like his. I would say that humor is his daily practice. And it could be so simple. And I think for me, it's thank you and gratitude. It was like I try to think like, who can I thank today or show some appreciation towards? And I have to be honest with you, I have a really hard job. There's a lot of stress happening, but I try to do a scan at the end of the day. And, if by the end of the week, I haven't literally formally said thank you to somebody for something, I will make an effort to send an email. And that's a practice too. And so
Yeah.
we can just keep doing those kinds of things on a regular basis and people will see, especially with gratitude appreciation practices or people who really struggle around, am I doing the right thing? Am I fitting in? To practice the 3 W's, which comes from positive psychology. And that's simply asking yourself, what went well?
Yeah.
What went
Yeah.
well today?
Right. And what didn't, and how can we kind of
Yeah,
regroup
but
the
I
next
want
day? Yeah.
people to focus on what went well because
Yeah.
things always will go wrong. But we have to actually, again, this is about where we place our attention is if you can focus on that one thing that went well, and it could have been out of your control. It could be like, oh my God, it's a beautiful day. I got outside. Like that's out of your control, but it is something that you can say that went well. Like my mood was so much better because the sun was out, right?
Yeah.
That went well. It could be just like a simple thing like, oh, I got that task done and, good for you. You didn't get those 10 other things done, but you got this one done. That went well. So we really have to orient our attention to the things that are going well because we have the problem of the tricky brain, which is going to prioritize everything that didn't go well.
Yeah. And that it's almost like the default kind of
Yes.
negativity right off the bat. It's interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned, make one person happy. I remember a couple of years ago, I was going for, the usual blood work you get for your cholesterol and all that stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm sitting in the waiting room and the woman comes out and just like, opens the door and it bangs against the wall. And she's like, next. And, or calls my name. And I could tell she was in a super bad mood and wasn't really talkative. And then she's like, do you ever have a problem with like fainting with needles? And I'm like, no. And she was just still in a bad mood. And then I remembered where I won't get into the whole details, but some dads out there might understand, about maybe falling over when their kids are born in the hospital and turning white and pale. And I told her about this situation with me and she started laughing.
Yeah.
And I walked out and I'm like, I can I can recognize somebody else who's having a bad day or might
Yeah.
even be burned out, and I made them happy, and it actually made me feel happy that I
Yeah.
could just kind of lighten her up a little bit, you know?
Right. Totally. Well, there's an energy, right? That you
Yeah.
can feel the energy in that case.
Yeah, you kind of broke the ice, but she was just like
Yeah.
in a miserable mood. So
Listen, we have that kind of influence, David, right?
yeah.
In a very simple way. And if we can, calm our own nervous systems, calm somebody else's, have a little bit more lightness, everything else is going to go better, even the hard challenges,
Yeah. Now I
in
spent
life.
16 years in the restaurant business and everybody tortured me and all I wanted to do was jump over the counter and strangle them. So so
Yeah.
so so I'm proud of myself. so
Well,
so
listen, last thing I'll say is, when you ask people what they want, in their lives or, the kind of people they want to be with, listen, kindness comes at the top of the list. And in fact, yesterday someone said that to me, woman 30, she's not partnered yet, she's feeling the pressure and all of that. And I said, well, what do you want for yourself? And she said, well, this is going to sound so silly. She's like, but I just want somebody, who's kind. I'm like,
yeah.
that's not silly. Like, why would we even think that that's silly? But we do because I don't know. It's not about, being a one percenter and having wealth or whatever you could put on a resume. It's like people want kindness in their life. And we need to practice it for ourselves. And then we practice it in the world and we will attract people who are kind,
Yeah.
So,
No, and
um,
that's we need those people around us as well. That's a really, really great point. So
yes, we do. We need the allies. I say we need the positivity allies in our life.
yeah, I
Yeah.
can't tell you how many people that I've worked with over the years where they're pretty much in a toxic work environment. Their
Mhm.
their their workplace is literally chaos, and they try and speak up, and they can't affect any change. And the boss is totally cool with them working all day in
Mhm.
meetings and then having to work over the weekends or whatever to catch
Yeah.
up, and they don't care, and that's not going to change. And I think you're right, they're surrounded by
Yeah.
negativity, so the more we can surround ourselves with kind and compassionate people, I think especially for the ADHD brain
Mhm.
is almost mission critical, you know?
It totally is.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes we can't change our work environments because we need the paycheck or we're not in a place yet to make a shift. But you can. I remember when I was an intern, I was working at one of the local hospitals and it was very toxic and very crazy. And I just thought, why did I even get into this profession in the first place? I really was at an identity crisis. And then I had one. She was just a couple years older than me, but we were running a trauma group together. And it was just such an awful experience as a trainee. And she just said, listen, this place is crazy. It's not going to change, but you need to find those pockets of warmth, of connection. And she had this beautiful metaphor. She was just like, just imagine that you were just holding this like cute, sweet, little mouse in your pocket and you had to hold it so lightly and you were carrying it around with you all day. And of course, when she said that to me, it made me cry at the moment. But I really took that for the rest of my year because I was like, where do I find the places of connection and nurturance in my life? And that's where I need to focus on. And all that other stuff, I got to endure it. Okay, I got to get through this. But I really have to put my attention on the things where I am getting nourished, where I am finding those connections. And it was really good advice.
Yeah.
And and we do need to find those in the crazy world that we live in and in the workplaces we might find ourselves in.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have in the book Kindness in Practice, kind of a
Mhm.
list of things that for those of you who are going to pick up the book, it's page 187, at least in my version here. Okay. Um, can you kind of walk us through why that is so important and maybe some of those kind of initial things people can take action on?
Well, I think that sometimes we don't stop to reflect or give our brains and bodies time just to find that inner still voice. Like we
Mm,
all have an inner still wise voice, and when we can slow down enough to actually listen to it, I think it could be really fruitful. And so the 20 questions thing is like you used to do the 20 questions game, like, on road trips with the kids. But I thought, where are the 20 questions? And so I threw some in there, like, what does a meaningful life look like to me? Or if I knew I couldn't fail, what would I do? Like that's
yeah.
a fun question that people ask a lot. And then people really rack their brains. And then they come up with these funny, crazy ideas. I'm like, okay, now they've said it. Maybe they'll actually find a way to do that. But what would I regret not doing at least once in my life? What am I proud of? And we don't always ask ourselves those questions. Who was one person in our life, that really helped? Because I'm thinking back to those report cards that you mentioned at the beginning. Was there somebody along the way? It might not have been somebody close to you, but that really encouraged you. And honestly, if people, when they sit and they think about who was kind to them in their life, sometimes it could have been, I don't know, the bus driver
Yeah.
or somebody like you showing up and that woman was having a bad day, but we need to kind of remember that there's that too. And so
I
that's usually
remember,
all.
I
You remember
remember,
somebody?
well, yeah, and but I'm ADD before I forget.
Uh-huh.
I was mentioned this to my wife last week is, it was like fifth grade and
Mm.
I got thrown out of class and I was told to go sit in back then in the elementary school outside the room with these little cubby holes where the kids hung their coats and
Yeah.
you know so I was sitting in the cubby hole all by myself and the janitor came up and
Mm.
sat down um and asked me what happened and just kind of comforted me. It was the janitor,
Yes.
that's what we called them back then, with this janitor,
Yes. Yeah.
but it's one of those kind of childhood memories that stuck with me because it was somebody that saw the kid that was whatever. I don't know if I was crying. I don't know what the heck was going on.
Suffering in
But he
some
came
way.
in, he sat down and,
Right.
talked to me and asked me and made me feel better. I probably ended up in the principal's office after that.
But
But to your
listen,
point, that's,
right.
somebody reached out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when you start talking about it, I'm sure that your wife had a response to you, right? I mean, these are really important
Yeah.
conversations. Like,
Yeah.
oh, that's so sweet, and we do have these moments in our lives. So who are the people that encouraged you, were kind to you? It could have been unexpected. And then when people start talking about it with each other, like around a table, like all of a sudden you see the energy. People
Yeah.
light up, right? So we need to make more space for that in our lives. So pausing and asking yourself some of these questions, I think can be really useful. And then it's like, what's one thing you can put into action?
Yeah.
Maybe it is being kind to somebody else first. Maybe it's doing a loving kindness meditation for the next 7 days. Because you know what the research shows is that doing that every day for a few weeks actually changes your internal physiology. Loving kindness meditation is a simple little prayer, may you be safe and protected. May
Yeah.
you live in happiness. And then you say that to yourself. May I be safe and protected. May I live in peace and kindness, happiness. You come up with your own words, but just that every single day, a couple of minutes really accumulates a benefit over time. And so that's why, what can you put into practice is so helpful.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, thank you for taking the time. This is an important conversation. I know we spoke a few years ago, um, but I've been wanting to revisit this and like I said, just kind of the basics so people understand how they can be a little more kind to yourself. It's the kindness cure. What we were talking about. I want you to read the whole book, people, but page 187 is some of the things that we just discussed, and some of those things that if you're eager to get started, you can fast forward and start to ask yourself those questions. So I will have you back for the perfectionism book. We definitely have to have that conversation, if not a couple. So
oh yeah, some of my favorite people. I'm one myself. I feel like I'm continually recovering as a perfectionist.
All right, well, thanks again. We'll see you soon.